Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Just Pursued. Just Pursued by Laura Coates is a memoir about a black female prosecutor and her time at the Department of Justice. You get the perspective of her coming into the agency as someone new to the office, and then a bit of insight as she gets a bit further along in her career. Now, to be clear, this isn't a chronological story or a day-by-day account of her career at the Department of Justice. Instead, Coates picks out a few significant cases and discusses what was going on in her life at the time, the details of the case, and how the case affected her. In addition to books I've read for Noir Histoire and then just personal reading, I've read quite a few books about the justice system from the perspective of being on the street, as far as police officers, investigators, in the courtroom from the perspective of defense attorneys, as well as prosecutors, judges, all those kinds of things. And as well as like a more top-level view of the justice system, looking into some of the injustices and inequalities, how certain laws develop, precedents, things of that nature. But this book was a little bit different, as I think so far I've read about the prosecution of cases, but not really from the perspective of a prosecutor, more so about particular court cases going to trial, maybe along those lines, but not really from the perspective of a prosecutor, and not at this level, at least with regards to books that I could remember in like recent memory. So that was a different perspective for me. Part of the premise of the book is that by Laura Coates being a black woman and an attorney, I wouldn't say that she better recognizes, but probably more directly points the finger at and is able to call out some of the injustices within the system. But that's not exactly what ends up happening here. Don't get me wrong, there are certainly some cases that help to express this, but I feel I've read some other books that I think do a better job of this, in part because I read in reviews and I felt this was an opinion that I shared, at least to some degree, was that there's a lot of statement of facts, but not a lot of analysis. I've read a few other books such as The New Jim Crow, The Color of Law, books along those lines that speak about policy, procedure, how they developed, as well as true crime books that I've read, just for my own interest. Books related to the Innocence Project, Just Mercy, books that take a look at the justice system either from a top-level view where they might review a few cases and then analyze the laws that were affected by, or the precedent that they set, or how they affected these particular cases, from the perspective of following a particular case from start to finish, or just speaking about the justice system in general. And through that, different laws, how they came about, a more top-level view, as well as, in some instances, getting more in depth, using specific cases as examples. But that's not really what happens here. Instead, you certainly have examples of cases and situations that Coates has found herself in through her career, but there's not as much analysis. It's kind of like a stating of fact, but not really a breakdown of case law like what I've read in other books. And that's not to say that it's good or bad. It just feels a little bit different after having read some other books. I felt those books, now granted, I'm not a lawyer, right? I don't study law or anything along those lines. So to some degree, I kind of, not that I want the author to tell me what to believe, but it's like, I need you to state your point and then provide information or examples to back it up. From there, like, sure, your opinions, whatnot, but to some degree, I need you to explain the law to me, right? And that's not to say that the book isn't approachable, but rather that I think you get the point that Coates is trying to make, but she doesn't exactly make the connections for you that allow you to really connect these points she's trying to make with the overall story, like where the perspective is supposed to be. At least to some degree, her perspective as a black woman who was a prosecutor, a black woman working within this justice system, we can all state has been, arguably continues to be unfair and unjust in its handling of black people in particular, but also non-white people, the poor, etc. But I think that part of what appealed to me and made me pick up the book, but I think it kind of fell short, was the premise, right? The sense that she never really dives into the larger implications. It come across as, not to say that I expect to be spoon-fed, because I can certainly make my own views, form my own opinions, but I prefer when the authors have a point that they're trying to make, they present an argument. They present kind of like trial, right? Where the defense has one perspective, the prosecution has another. They both come in, they present their evidence, they make connections and things like that. They try to explain as best as they can. And ultimately, at the end of it, it's left up to the jury to decide what they believe. And I feel like that doesn't really happen here, in the sense of, when you watch like court cases, it's kind of like the book begins with this premise or with this opening statement. You get evidence presented to you, but then there's nothing really to tie it together. I still got through the book. I still thought the book was good, but this kind of lack of connecting the dots and analysis and whatnot kept the book from being especially great. Like, it was good, but I don't think it was great. I believe that maybe a few months or so ago, within a month or two of reading the book, I felt like I heard mention of it on a podcast, or I might have listened to a podcast where the author was interviewed. I don't quite remember, but something along those lines. But that's sort of like how I found out about the author and then ended up looking into the book. Because from what I heard during this interview, it sounded pretty interesting. I've read several books at this point where they speak about wrongful convictions, how laws develop, a variety of different topics within the justice system. But most of those books, they typically follow, at least the ones I've read so far, a lot of times they follow like a defense attorney. There's like maybe one or two where they might have followed a prosecutor or at least touched base with the prosecutor while covering a case, but not as closely as the ones that I've read where like the book follows the defense attorney's journey. There's one book in particular that I read, which I can't remember the name of now, but it was pretty much about individuals who had been convicted, wrongly so. I believe it was like 10 chapters or so, and each chapter focused on the way in which individuals involved in prosecution, be that people who work at the lab, police officers, prosecutors, how they could skew cases, or types of evidence that could either be manipulated or flawed with regards to what they imply in cases. And so in each chapter, the author presents a premise, like let's say eyewitness testimonies. From there, he would then focus on a particular case, or maybe a few court cases where eyewitness testimony was used, and then later on, would break down how it could be flawed, how it could be manipulated, how it was flawed and manipulated, and why it's not dependable, or why it needs to be taken with caution. Then sort of like using that case, the criteria, right, to set, so then using the court cases that fit that criteria, that set precedents to explain his perspective. And I feel like that doesn't really happen here. Instead, you have it where Coates states this premise at the start of the book. You get examples, but then you don't really get much in the way of analysis. So, for example, one of the earliest cases in the book, I believe, takes place shortly after she begins working at the Department of Justice, where there's an individual who, I don't remember exactly what the crime was, but a crime was committed against him. I think he was like, it was like something with his car, like the car was stolen or something like that. But they found the person, he decided to press charges. And when the person who committed this crime, came up, like when the court case was called up, and in running the victim's name through a computer database, it turned out that there was a warrant for this man's arrest. Because he was now in his 30s, had never been in trouble with the law, but had entered the country illegally some decades before when he was a young man. And now decades later, when he's settled down, had a family, is working, because of this contact with the justice system, despite him being a victim, it put him on immigration's radar. And so the protocol in situations like this would be that the person would have to be reported to ICE and would then possibly face immediate deportation. So this is actually the first story in the book. And so with that, Coates, I think, as most of us would feel, would imagine, you're the prosecutor assigned to get in some kind of justice for this individual who's had a crime committed against him. They've been victimized in some way. You make assurances to them and whatnot. They show up to court, or rather they show up to your office on the day of court, and here it is that you're kind of backed into a corner by policy to report them to the authorities. From your interactions with them and preparing for this case, you know that they've established a life here in America. They've never been in trouble. trouble. They haven't broken the law or anything along those lines. Well, aside from like coming into the country illegally, they were trying to do the right thing. They were trying to get justice for themselves. And now here it is that they're facing the possibility of being deported. They're facing negative consequences and repercussions for doing the right thing. And so with that, I think most of us would feel like, quite honestly, that was one of the most hard-hitting stories that she provided, because I understood and was able to sympathize with her, feeling a little bit guilty, trying to do everything that she could to circumvent having to essentially set the stage for this man being deported. And so adding to it is that, or making matters worse actually, is that the man mistakenly came to her office rather than going to the courthouse. But there were pretty much orders that wherever he arrived, that due to this warrant, he was to be taken into custody. And it's like, imagine how you would feel, right? You would feel as though you betrayed this individual, that you basically led them into a trap. Now, granted, that certainly wasn't her intention. Like, she didn't set out to trap this guy. She didn't tell him to file the charges. But by encouraging him to move forward with the case, to move forward with the prosecution, she kind of set the stage and made it possible for him to come to the attention of the authorities, and thus, him then being deported. And it's like, there's a saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, where she isn't trying to get this guy into trouble, but just through her ending up with this case, how things shook out, that due to him making contact with the justice system, she just knew of him as a victim, and him following up on those charges has now led to negative repercussions. It's like the guilt of having to carry that. But at the same time, I would hope that you would rest assured knowing that you did everything possible to try to prevent this from happening. And looking at that, she speaks about her experience and how she felt in the moment, but doesn't really make the connection to the broader picture, right? Where here it is that you have this individual who's part of a marginalized community, and being an immigrant, being from another country, things along those nature. I'm not saying that it's right that he entered the country illegally, but rather that circumstances and situations are taken into consideration for other people. But here, in this situation, when you have someone who's part of a marginalized group, arguably unfavorably treated, you have it where he's not extended the same degree of grace and understanding that more privileged groups might be. So it's like, if you think about it, court cases that you've heard where either, a wealthy young man a few years back, I think was a college student at Stanford, and was found, seen sexually assaulting a young woman who was intoxicated or otherwise under the influence of something. And so because of his family, because of his background, him attending this prestigious school, and by all indications, the real possibility that with that background, with those opportunities, with that privilege, that he would go on and, from a professional financial standpoint, have a rather successful life. And given that he had this potential, that he showed this promise, despite committing this heinous act, he was offered a second chance. He was given another opportunity to move forward with his life. In that situation, I thought that was a terrible decision. But there's this idea that they didn't want to destroy his life as a young man because he made a quote-unquote mistake. That given his youth, that given his potential, he should be given an opportunity. He should be given another chance. Then you have this individual who, once upon a time long ago, committed this victimless crime. It's a crime, fine, but victimless. And in the time since, he stayed out of trouble. He's living a stable life. He's married and whatnot. He's not been in any kind of problems. But here it is that in his situation, because of who he is and his lack of privilege, there can't be any flexibility or understanding for his situation. Now, granted, we're talking about different kinds of cases, right? Different courts. But I think the main gist of it remains that it shows some inequality in the justice system, where here it is that you have this individual who committed this quote-unquote victimless crime and is part of a marginalized community. And then you have this other individual who has caused bodily harm to someone else. But because of his privilege, because of his pedigree, his connections and things like that, he's deemed as being deserving of a second chance, of being granted some grace and understanding. It's like this kid with the affluenza, right? Who initially got into trouble for, I believe it was driving a vehicle under the influence, hitting several individuals, causing great injury to them, and I believe even death, he got a slap on the wrist because it was deemed that he grew up in circumstances where he was never held accountable for his actions. And as a result of his wealth, that kind of spoiled him, led to him making this mistake, but that he should be given another chance. Here's this thing where you have people of privilege, people from privileged groups, or, who are extended certain courtesies that individuals from marginalized groups are not. So I thought that was one of the really most poignant ways, one of the most impactful ways in which this disparity was presented. The different cases and whatnot made me feel different ways. Like, I didn't always feel for the victims or the perpetrators, but the cases that really stood out to me was like the first one with the guy that ended up being deported. And then another case that also stood out to me was more towards the end of the book, about a young woman who had been molested and sexually assaulted by her stepfather while her mom was sick. And the details surrounding that of this woman being unprotected by her mother. It's not a cut and dry situation, but at the same time, I'm not excusing, the mom's actions or lack thereof, but really that this young woman was victimized, and in coming before the court, and, there's this thing of her body being objectified, where it happened through the stepfather, him objectifying her body, being inappropriate towards her. And then you see that she now comes to court after speaking up about what happened, and she's victimized once again, this time by the judge. And that case in particular, the first case with the guy that was deported, I felt sorry for him. I also felt sorry for Coates as well, because I understood her feelings of guilt in that situation. But the situation with the young woman with the stepfather that was molesting her, her biting up the courage. I think at this point we've learned a lot about the victims of crimes, right? That they don't all react in the same way, that not everyone immediately reports what's happened to them, but yet there's an expectation that things will be otherwise, right? Which is really unfounded. It's not based in reality, or it's not always the rule. Sometimes and quite often it's the exception. But like that story, I found myself being, number one, feeling heartbroken for this young woman, and then secondly, being angry on her behalf. That might not even be the word, but frustrated maybe. That here you have this young person, someone who as a minor has had a crime committed against her, that she ends up being the person attacked, that she ends up being the person put under the microscope, rather than this individual who's been accused of a crime. Like, that really messed with me. I think of all the stories in the book, that was probably the most impactful. Now, granted, part of that might be that it was closer towards the end of the book. And thus, I think, I remembered the case studies that were presented early in the book and then later in the book, closer to the start. And because, to be quite honest, some of the cases in the middle really began to run together for me. In addition, there's an unfortunate story about a young man from a pretty stable family and background who, in his quest for acceptance, really just throws himself in the path of the justice system. There's also, some unfortunate stories about victims of domestic violence as well as child abuse. Don't get me wrong, the stories are impactful. You find yourself shaking your head, feeling sad, sympathizing with the victims, but it feels like the one thing that ties them together is Coates. They don't really feel connected. Rather, they just feel like these disjointed moments from her life. Cases that she's been a part of, she kind of fails to tie it back together, right? It's like they're supposed to be a stated overarching theme of the book. And maybe I went into this expecting the wrong thing. I still enjoyed the book, but I was expecting it to be more of a book about social commentary on the justice system. But it kind of comes across more as one person's experience as a prosecutor within the justice system. And it might sound like the same thing, but they're actually quite different, in that I was expecting her to use her experience to speak about the broader justice system. It's like there are a few instances of that, but not nearly as much as I thought. I expected rather. Granted, the book does solely focus on her and her personal life as far as what was going on while cases were taking place, so it provides some context and background. But I don't know, I got through the book. It was just lacking something to make it great. and certainly to make it as great as I think it could have been. Just because it felt very much like one person's experience rather than her taking a step out and really breaking down like the broader implications of the cases and the things she's witnessed and experienced. Which quite often when I read books, it's like the opposite, where you'll have authors would be trying to make a point about a specific social justice issue, and it's like they take such a top level view that they fail to include the human element, or they focus on too broad a topic without really trying to back it into like an individual, a group of individuals to humanize the point that they're trying to make, to humanize the story. But here it's kind of like the opposite, where it's so much about this individual that it doesn't feel big enough. Like, she doesn't take the examples and put them into context where you have something more to glean and learn about the justice system at large. I think having read this book after reading others, I can kind of see where it fits in and some of the points that she makes. But I think if you were to just read this book on its own, it would be hard to see those connections. It's kind of like a book that you need to read as a companion piece to other books about the justice system, to kind of where some of those other books make the connections, because they're not made here. They're not really presented here. I think if you go into the book knowing what to expect, which is that this is kind of like, in a sense, the professional memoirs of a specific prosecutor, you might enjoy it more than I did. And once again, that's not to say that I didn't enjoy the book. It's just that I had different expectations. And so it's like I had to kind of recalibrate as I was reading the book. And once I made that mental adjustment that, you know, there's what I was expecting and there's the reality of what I'm going to get from this book, I was able to settle in, and I found it quite interesting at that point. It was different from what I originally expected, but all in all, it's a good book. I still think that despite some of the maybe drawback or shortcomings, it's still worth checking out. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.